Hello, me again. Today I just want to talk about a life at Versailles and the royal court in general. Um, so basically, at the royal court, there would have been hundreds and hundreds of people living there. You know, courtiers, nobles, servants, so on. Anyway, at the top of the list, there'd be the king and the queen, and they'd have a set of five. I can't speak. And a set of 5-room apartments to each of them. And these rooms would consist of the first antechamber, the second antechamber, the large chamber, the bedchamber, and the inner chamber. And the inner chamber was the most private room in the court. So only a select few could be invited into those rooms. They'd be the royals' most private rooms. And so basically, every morning, every single day of the court, the people would have to follow the daily ritual routines of the court. So as I say, I've probably seen in my last video, but basically, when a royal would get up in the morning, they would be dressed in front of a crowd of people, and they would be separated by like a sort of banner in front of like a sort of railing that separates the royal half of the room from the normal half of the room. In the normal half, there would be courtiers, nobles, and they would stuff their way into this room, like literally crowd themselves into this room so that nobody can move, and they would watch the royal get dressed. And the most ridiculous thing is, only the highest ranking member of I can't speak today. Only the highest ranking member in that room could dress the royal. So if it was a princess of the blood or a prince, they would be the only ones who could dress the royal, whether it be the king or a princess or whatever. Anyway, after that, they would head in this massive procession. So let's take Versailles for example. So they would all process the whole court. They would all process from the king's apartments, or let's say they would process from the Hall of Mirrors, the whole court, in a massive sort of crowd, and they would walk towards the chapel for mass. And at this point, this would be your chance to speak to the king, ask him for favours, that sort of thing. Even just a little conversation with the king to make your status a bit more. You could increase your status by just having like an informal word with the king. So the court would process towards the chapel, and when they arrived at the chapel, the courtiers would go on the sort of side platforms around the chapel, and at the end of the chapel, the royal family would be seated, and then right ahead there'd be the altar and all sorts of things. So they would do like communion and daily and Bible reading, that sort of thing. Sometimes there was one incident in Versailles history where the abbé, the vicar, he had like he shouted at the king in front of everyone at the chapel because he was being a bad king. Anyway, after the mass, the court would process to this large chamber where the royal king and the queen would be seated around this big table that would be filled with like elaborate dishes, swans, that sort of thing, all stuffed, and they could just pick and choose what they wanted. Obviously, there'd be so much food for them that they could only eat a tiny portion of it. So they would do that, and people could all come into the room and watch the royals eat. And so after that, the king would have to go to a council meeting in his private chamber, and they would discuss the doings and goings of the royal palace, and they would discuss the king's finances, that sort of thing. If the king was wifeless, if that's a word, if the king did not have a wife, then this meeting, they would discuss the wives that the king could choose. So after that, the king could go off hunting on the estate, and they would hunt fox, that sort of thing, anything like pheasants, and they would take hundreds of hunting dogs that would go running off, and when the animals would be shot, the dogs would go and collect them and bring them back. And the whole court some of the people would sit in this little sit on like a blanket, and they would have a lovely buffet, and this would be after the hunt was finished, and they'd all be huddled around this big blanket, and they'd all be And the Queen wasn't really allowed to hand out food because it was a sign that, she was too royal to hand out food to people. But take Marie Antoinette for example. She did that anyway. She was, people think of her as like this snob, but actually, when she lived in Vienna, her mother, Maria Theresa, she actually asked her children to go and give food out to the local fishwives in the town. And so Marie Antoinette would have been brought up, as a kind of... She would have been brought up as this lady that understood people better, because she had more experience with them as a child. Anyway, so after the hunt, some nights in the palace, the royal apartments would be opened up in the evening, and they would be opened up for gaming evenings, and sometimes a lady would get up and sing in front of everybody, or a member of the court would play like an instrument in front of people, and they could sit around doing cards, that sort of thing. And it was a really kind of relaxed atmosphere. And obviously there'd be candles everywhere, and the room would be lit up. It'd be beautiful. So that's that. And then after that, the king would head back to his bedchamber, probably followed by a couple of nobles or something, a couple of courtiers, and he would be undressed, and the people could watch him being undressed for bed. It's called the royal coucher, and the royal morning dress is called the levee. Okay, so then he would go to bed, and his curtains would be drawn, and everyone would head out of the room. I talk with my hands a lot, as you see. But yeah, that's that. But I mean, you think of the court as this beautiful kind of extravagant place, but it is. But on the other side, it's actually the most disgusting place you've ever seen in your life. During Louis XIV's reign, the courtiers wore wigs because their hair would fall out because they had syphilis, and they would have boils on their heads as well. So they powdered their wigs as well. It had like lead in it and stuff. And the women's makeup on their faces had lead in it too, so obviously they'd get like marks. And smallpox was a massive killer in that time. So people would have, if they survived it, they would have had scars on their faces, which they would have covered up with little tiny little red and black hearts that they would stick on their faces, all sorts of different shapes. And obviously, sometimes they didn't brush their teeth, did they? So they would actually replace their teeth with wooden teeth. Or perhaps even teeth from dead soldiers, or just the dead in general. Yeah, so that's basically it. And the ladies at the court, they'd be dressed in these sort of massive, wide, beautiful court dresses, but they couldn't actually breathe in them properly. They pulled the corsets so tight that sometimes ladies fainted because they just couldn't breathe properly. On the floor, it would have a wee and poo all over the place because there was no toilets at Versailles, so servants would actually relieve themselves behind closed doors, in corridors, stairwells, that sort of thing. And it was not the most hygienic place. So you can understand why Marie Antoinette would have wanted to escape to the Petit Trianon in the grounds, because it was so disgusting at the palace. Anyway, thank you for watching. I'll do another video in a minute about some more stuff. And thank you for watching, and I'll make another video soon. Thank you.